Yes, hello again. So welcome back to CDB TV as we are currently in the process of going through all of the pictures and the video clips that we shot at this year's 2025 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, which of course we'll get to as soon as we can. But until then, we're going to take a look at a nice bunch of vintage classic racers that if you're a subscriber or even a regular visitor to my channel, then you may have already seen a couple of clips already about Cecil Pearson and his machines. But in this featured video this time, we're going to talk a little about Cecil and his background and how he actually got started with his collection of Rickman Jap racers. And we'll also have a gander around his workshop where all of the magic happens to keep this unique collection of bikes on the track. Plus, we'll be able to have a quick listen to what one of these unique Jap engines sound like when they burst into life. So we've quite a bit to get through, so let's just crack on and start with a quick resume of Cecil Pearson himself. So Cecil Pearson's story really all began when he initially started his working life as a diesel mechanic before then moving on to building houses and other general construction structures, which he continued with for many years, although even during that time he was still heavily involved in motorcycle sport and classic scrambling in particular, and he continued to support his local Northern Ireland Classic Scramble Club, of which he's still involved with even now in 2025. Now, the very first Jap racer that Cecil built was this number 11 bike, which he raced for many years, having varying degrees of success on the track while he did so. And because he liked that initial Rickman Jap so much, he then decided to build another and then another. And before he knew it, Cecil now currently has 6 Rickman framed Jap Scramblers and 3 Jap Specials with bespoke frames that were built by a young local engineer called Harry Stitt. But these 5 Rickman Japs that you're looking at were just the start of what was to be a very unique assembly of vintage racers that Cecil would go on to build upon in the coming years and months. And when I took these pictures of the bikes, which was back in 2014, this was my very first encounter meeting the great man and his machines at his local scramble at Ballyblack Road in Northern Ireland. And ever since that first encounter, I've returned year upon year to document and watch this collection grow into what is now possibly the best assortment of Jap racers, not only in Europe, but possibly globally as well. Now, of course, having 9 of these Rickman Jap race bikes, Cecil can't possibly ride them all on his own, and to be quite truthful, I think Cecil would be the first person to admit that even at 70 odd years old now, his best racing days are probably behind him now, but these days Cecil's passion is actually seeing the bikes racing on the track and then doing all of the repairs to keep them running. And that's why he now has a team of relative youngsters to put the bikes through their paces. And so as of 2024, from left to right, we have Harry Stitt, and he's the young genius that made the 3 frames for Cecil's specials. And the centre there is John Griffiths, who also rides his 74 CCM when he's not riding for Cecil's team. And on the right there is James Thompson, who's just an all-round top rider who usually races in about 4 or sometimes even 5 different classes on the day. But to complete our Team Jap quartet, we have this man here, Adrian Lappin, another very talented rider and general all-round good guy, of which no self-respecting classic racing club could do without. So that's the guys who ride the bike. So let's now just take a look at the machines themselves, starting with those 3 Harry Stitt specials. And so these 3 bikes here on the left were commissioned by Cecil, and Harry Stitt specifically designed and manufactured the frames to accept all of the dimensions of the press switch engine. But these 3 Stitt specials are very unique, and as far as I'm aware, less than a small handful of these HS chassis have been manufactured to take these Jap motors. And these Harry Stitt Japs aren't some kind of copy of a popular model like maybe a BSA or some other British or European motorcycle brand. Harry Stitt did all of the design work, fabrication and the welding on these chassis, and then he had them all painted red to try and blend in with the Jap logo. But as per the Rickman chassis in the other bikes, these are fabricated from good quality steel, and they also keep the motor's engine oil inside the frame. Although we've already discussed these Harry Stitt specials in another video here on my channel in a lot more detail, so we'll try not spend too much time looking at them here. But it's suffice to say, as old school classics go, this is without doubt one belter of a bike with that bespoke frame and that monster press switch engine inside. And if you're an avid reader of the quarterly VMX magazine, then you may remember that I did a full feature on this bike in that magazine a few years back. But to say that Cecil was pleased how his Harry Stitt bikes turned out would be the understatement of the year. And for his recent birthday, Harry Stitt also gifted Cecil this replica model of the self-same chassis that his HS specials are made of when he built this first HS number 15 unit, which although was number 15 off the Stitt production line, it was still one of the very first Cecil Pearson Jap specials that he produced. But anyhow, let's get back to our Rickman Japs, which all basically consist of a 1960s Rickman frame kit with swing arm, fuel tank, bodywork kit, seat and tail cone, and of course all of the other add-ons are do-it-yourself parts that you collect together to finish off the remainder of the bikes. And just for good measure, more or less all of the parts on all of the bikes are almost kept identical, so that Cecil can either swap or change individual components from bike to bike as required. But these Rickmans all have alloy fuel tanks, matchless front brake hubs, and of course rock shocks fitted onto the rear to sort out the back suspension. So keeping the bikes more or less fitted with the same components, it does have its advantages. So let's just now move on to those fantastic 4-stroke Jap engines, or John Alfred Press Switch to give him his full title, who originally began by designing and manufacturing movie projectors for the film industry way back in the early 1900s, and he later went on to produce internal combustion engines to power all manner of things, including farm machinery and some of the early motorcycles of their day. But he was a brilliant engineer, and he certainly paved the way for many future engine manufacturers to improve on his very unique designs. Anyhow, more or less all of these Jap engines that are powering Cecil's race bikes are from the early 1930s, and these methanol burning bruisers are a big long stroking 600cc 4-stroke that were originally designed to be used in speedway or dirt bike race bikes, and if you're of a certain age then you'll maybe still remember those times when more or less all speedway racers were powered by these press switch engines. Now, with regards to the actual specifications of these motors, they were, as I said, a long stroking 4-valve 600 that ran on methanol and not your regular gas, because they say that using methanol makes the cylinder run slightly cooler, and it also increases the power, and it also helps to cut down on pre-detonation, or pinking as it was sometimes called. So to supply all the sparks to ignite that methanol fuel air mixture, Cecil has these ignition systems custom made for these bikes, and basically it consists of a fully self-contained rechargeable battery and coil system that has all of the engine mapping inside the package, and it's a simple job of charging the unit up before fixing it inside the chassis. But this ignition system is very robust and more or less 100% reliable. Now, one of the other intriguing factors of these John Alfred press switch engines is that they had dry sumps, which basically means that no oil is kept inside the engine, as it's all held in the front down tube of the frame, and it's then gravity fed to this small external oil pump, where the oil is then pumped around all of the important parts of the engine, and then any unused lubricant that's not required simply drips onto the ground, which is exactly why it's called a total loss oil lubrication system. Not, of course, something that your environmentalists will want to hear about and all, but this was the motorcycle technologies of the 1930s. And here on the gearbox transmission side, the Jap motor is, of course, pre-unit, so the gearbox is a separate entity from the engine, but connected by way of a primary chain to the clutch. But on all of Cecil's bikes, the gearbox is a Norton AMC unit, and the clutches again on all of the bikes are dry clutches that are cooled by the ambient air that runs past them when the engine's running. So these dry clutches don't take too kindly to riders holding them disengaged while the engine's running, but you can see that Cecil's fabricated these alloy covers just to try and help keep dust, dirt and some of the moisture from entering that primary chain and its delicate clutch components. Now, the exhaust system again on these Jap engines is just a straight through big bore pipe with absolutely no silencer or tailpipe to dampen down that fantastic music that's played from the Jap engine. And if you can hang on until the end of this video, we'll have a sneaky little listen to one of these Jap engines when we get Cecil to fire up one of these superb press switch power plants. But as we move on to the front end of our Jap collection, now as I remember, I'm pretty sure it was a pair of Italian Marzocchi forks that were fitted to most of the Rickman Scramblers, and the front hub and the brakes are, as I said, are all taken from the British-made matchless which is a big alloy hub with the old school drum and shoe type arrangement. And once more here at the back of all of the Japs, Cecil uses British-made rock shocks on all of these bikes, and every time that Cecil buys a brand new set of shocks, he strips them down and then rebuilds them with different valves, etc., so that he has them with the right specification that he requires. Now, that's not to say that these RockShox suspension units weren't of decent quality. It's just that Cecil is very particular how he likes the bikes to handle, so he likes to set them up to his own personal preferences, because he's very particular about how these bikes run on the track. Now, also at the back here, as I remember, I'm sure Cecil told me that he used KTM rear hubs and brakes on the back of all of his Rickman racers, but with regards as to why he chose KTM hubs rather than maybe something British or Japanese, I'm guessing that the KTM parts are much easier to come by than the more less obtainable British-based components. And again, all of the fuel tanks on all 9 of Cecil's Jap Scramblers are, as you've guessed, made from alloy and not the original fiberglass items that Rickman supplied with their frame kits in the 1960s. And I can only guess that it's because Cecil's bikes are all running on methanol rather than regular gas, and I'm not sure what long-term effects the methanol would have had on the original fiberglass tanks, so I expect that's one of the reasons that Cecil's opted for these alloy items. But nevertheless, when you see these bikes all lined up and on display, they always seem to draw big crowds wherever they go. And when it comes to transporting this collection, then normally Cecil says that he can usually squeeze about 6 or sometimes even 7 bikes into his box van, along with all of the tools and the spares and the fuel that he'll need for a race weekend. So usually that consists of 4 race bikes for the team riders and maybe another 3 or 4 bikes as backups for each rider should their machine have some kind of mechanical trouble track side. But it's not unusual if Cecil's racing at his local track to even take all 9 bikes to the track, but naturally he has to then make 2 trips to make sure that he gets everything in place. But whether these bikes are inside their transporter or even lined up soldier style on display in a paddock somewhere, you still have to admit they're a pretty impressive looking sight. And so after another very highly successful weekend on the track, and the bikes are unloaded from the transporter, the very first thing that they need, of course, is a good old fashioned wash and scrub up before then inspecting every single bike for any breakages or damage, so that it can then be put right when it goes to Cecil's workshop. And although we did say earlier on that Cecil was now retired, looking after this fleet of classic racers is more or less a full-time job, because quite often Cecil's next race event could be just maybe a week or 2 away, so he has to work very long hours to get all 9 bikes checked, repaired and serviced to make them all ready for their next racing encounter. But thankfully, as you can see, Cecil's got quite a well-equipped workshop with all of the tools and the machines that he'll need to complete any kind of repairs on these bikes, like this lovely Elliott Omni-Speed lathe, which he does use for a multitude of different tasks, because those 1930s Jap motors do take a lot of maintenance to keep them running. So this piece of quality engineering here will get quite a bit of use at manufacturing new parts for those press switch motors. Now, I'm not an engineer, so I know nothing about how an intricate and precision piece of machinery such as this works, but if you're one of those workshop gurus who use all manner of mechanical and electrical tools to fabricate various components, then I'm sure you'll know exactly what you're looking at here. And in fact, another valuable tool in Cecil's workshop is this hydraulic press that he uses to push out bearings from casings, and it also comes in quite handy when he's dismantling and rebuilding those Jap engines' crankshafts. But looking around Cecil's workshop, you can see a collection of different bikes in various stages of repair, or some that are awaiting service just to get them ready for their next race event. Now, that number 55 bike there on the right hand side isn't a Jap, of course, but it's what's aptly named a Jawa berg, which is basically made up from a Husaberg chassis with a big 500cc 4-stroke Jawa engine inside. Now, this bike's never going to win the prettiest bike award at the next Concours Show competition, but don't be fooled by this bike's looks or its vintage appearance. This is still a seriously quick bike, which was originally built by Cecil, but is now being ridden by Philip Pearson, who is another member of the Pearson family. Now, we did make a very short video on this bike. I think it was about 10 years ago, and as I remember, it was a quite interesting build, so I think maybe it's about time that we did an updated version of this bike, so that's maybe something that we'll add to my to-do list in the coming weeks. And another recent introduction to Cecil's workshop is this rolling road that he had recently installed, so that he can use it to start the bikes in the workshop and then measure all of the engine's parameters and their performance. But as I said, to keep this unique collection of bikes going and performing on the track, it's a full-time job for Cecil, and many hours of hard work around the workshop, and anybody who races these kind of old classic bikes will certainly know how much time and money that they consume, and Cecil has to do that task 9 times over, so there's no question that he's a committed individual. And in actual fact, on the day that I visited Cecil's workshop, he was busy sitting at the bench welding some cracks in one of the alloy fuel tanks, and this was around 11:30 at night, because the bikes were all racing the next day. But as you'd expect, he wasn't going to allow me to stand about like a spare one at a wedding, so he gave me a pressure gauge and an airline to check all the tyre pressures on all of the bikes, and when you're finished doing that, he says you can get the polish out and give all the 9 Jap racers a bit of a bling up to make sure that they look nice for all the punters the next day. So you can see that I was well pleased with the result. But nevertheless, this number 6 Rickman Jap was the actual bike that had the cracked fuel tank that Cecil was busy repairing, which is a common occurrence on these alloy tanks due to the vibrations and all of the bumps and bashes that these old bikes go through when they're racing on the track. But we're going to have a quick listen to this bike start up just shortly. But when you just take a look around the workshop, you'll certainly find at least 3 or 4 Rickman bikes waiting on some kind of service, and this one here's waiting on its front forks being repaired. But there's always one or two of Cecil's machines lying around the workshop in various stages of destruction while he's waiting on parts, or maybe having to repair or even manufacture them himself. But Cecil does have a decent parts department, and some of the bits and pieces that he doesn't have, he can usually manage to source. Although he did tell me that camshafts are one of the very hard components to try and source for these Jap engines. So you can just imagine that preparation to get these Jap racers all repaired and then serviced to get them ready for their next race event all begins as soon as Cecil gets them back to his workshop. And although it's a great spectacle for the spectators to see these bikes lined up on display in a paddock and later performing on a track, then the amount of hours that Cecil spends getting them ready is no mean task by any stretch of the imagination. But when you see just how competitive these bikes are when they're actually racing against more modern machinery, then the long hours and the money spent on them certainly makes that tedious task all the more worthwhile. But nevertheless, as I continued to look around the workshop, I was asking myself, could this Rickman frame possibly be Jap Racer number 10? Because it does look like Cecil's already made the engine mounting plates, and he's also got a pair of Jap crankcases there sitting inside it just to try it for size. So who knows, we might be looking at the beginning of yet another addition to the Jap family. And if that was to happen, then it looks like Cecil's going to need a much bigger bike transporter. But even so, when you look at this collection of bikes and their statistics of being built from 1960s Rickman frames and those 1930s Jap engines, those factors alone make them quite unique, even as just a static display piece. But the icing on this particular Rickman Jap cake is just how fast and how quick these bikes are to ride, because they consistently beat much more modern bikes on a regular basis. So not only are they a piece of art as a display, they're also super quick as well. However, those bikes there aren't all of the Rickmans that Cecil has in his possession. He also has this Rickman framed Jawa that normally gets used as just a spare or kind of backup bike, just in case horror of horrors he runs out of Jap racers. And so this bike again can be another good backup when Cecil needs to use it. And on the other hand, there is yet another Rickman in Cecil's collection that we haven't mentioned as yet, and it's this fantastic looking Rickman matchless with the Rickman frame and, believe it or not, a matchless G50 road racing engine in the chassis. Now, this bike here was built by Adrian Moss, and at one time it was ridden by the legendary British Scrambles legend Andy Roberton. And as I remember, I think there was only about 2 or maybe possibly 3 of these bikes ever built. And you'd think that a full-blown road race engine just wouldn't be suitable as a Scrambles power plant, but it's just surprising how fast this bike was when Andy Roberton was riding it. Anyhow, there's already a full feature of this bike here on my channel, so it's certainly worthwhile checking that out. So as you can imagine, it's taken Cecil quite a good few years to amass this compendium of vintage racers, and by all accounts it doesn't appear that he's finished as yet, with more projects currently in the pipeline, and as you'd expect, the knowledge and the skills that Cecil has to keep these bikes running are very unique, because it's not everybody that can understand just how these Jap engines are put together or how they even work in practice. So as you can imagine, it's probably quite fair to say that Cecil lives, breathes, and he even walks the walk when it comes to all things John Alfred Prestwich, and even when it comes to Cecil's house decorations. He doesn't have a nice pot plant sitting in the window. He'd much rather have one of his spare Jap motors as a bit of house decoration, which of course needs no kind of maintenance whatsoever, and is almost definitely much nicer to look at as well. Right, so we've talked a little bit about Cecil and had a quick look around his workshop, and also had a gander at all of his lovely Jap racers. So with the aid of his humble assistant, let's just get this number 6 bike fired up after its recent fuel tank repair.
Better sitting on it maybe.
Where are you saying that noise coming from?
Huh?
What was that noise? You know where our fire extinguishers at the door.
Right, I'll drop the camera and go. Aye, I'll drop the camera and run for it.
But of course, there was another way to get a Rickman Jap fired up if you don't have the luxury of a rolling road, which Cecil will now demonstrate. And so, as we sum up this superb collection of vintage racers, you can see that we have a man here who's without doubt got a very big passion for not only building and maintaining these bikes, but for being able to enjoy them when his team of riders of James Thompson and Harry Stitt, John Griffiths and Adrian Lappin all put them through their paces on the track. And ever since I snapped these very first pictures of the bikes back in 2014, I've without doubt since then been educated and at times amazed at the performance of this collection of machines. And if ever you're out and about at some of the bigger classic scrambles in the south of the UK, or even in Cecil's native Northern Ireland, then I'm pretty sure that you'll already have come across these bikes, which are never hard to spot on the racetrack, because these are usually the first 3 or 4 that are riding at the front of the pack. And although these Rickman Jap bikes don't have the luxury of some of the more up-to-date components on the more modern bikes that they race against, they still make up for it in terms of speed and outright power. Although there are still plenty videos here on my YouTube channel if you want to take a look at the bikes in action on the track, and as I've said many times already in this video, it's only thanks to this man here and his love for his Rickman Japs that we're lucky to get a look at them at all.